Today, we are going to explore one of the greatest masterpieces of medieval engineering, the hydraulic system of the Alhambra Palace in Granada, Spain, a complex of canals, fountains, and mechanisms that defied gravity and transformed an arid hill into an oasis of beauty and functionality. Before we continue with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. It was a cold and rainy night in the winter of 1235. The walled city of Córdoba, on the Iberian Peninsula, slept under the constant sound of rain lashing the stone streets. The watchmen patrolled the walls with their flickering torches, unaware that the history of that city was about to change forever. Outside the walls, hidden by the darkness and the storm, a small group of Christian warriors, known as Almogavars, advanced silently toward the eastern fortifications. They were rugged men, accustomed to life on the frontiers, some of them Arabic speakers. That night they did not come with an entire army. They came with information. Dissatisfied residents of the eastern district, the Aksakia, had made contact and offered passage. With the agility of those who know ambush warfare, the Almogavars scaled a tower, met their allies inside the city, and before dawn could reveal what had happened, they already controlled a significant part of the neighborhood. The news reached King Ferdinand III of Castile in January 1236. The monarch, who had dedicated his life to the Christian Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula, did not hesitate. Against the advice of his advisors, who warned of the dangers of flooded and snow-covered roads, Ferdinand set out with a handful of knights toward Córdoba. He arrived in February under torrential rains and immediately began the siege of the Medina. In the following months, knights from all over Castile, Leon, and Galicia converged on the city. And on June 29, 1236, the city, that for more than 5 centuries had been one of the greatest centers of Islamic power in the West, the ancient capital of the Caliphate of Córdoba, surrendered. Ferdinand entered triumphantly. The great mosque, that monument which for nearly 500 years had symbolized the Islamic presence in Iberia, was consecrated as a Christian cathedral. It was a moment of profound transformation, and Córdoba was not an isolated case. In the decades that followed, Ferdinand III led a relentless campaign. City after city, the ancient citadels of Al-Andalus fell under the Christian advance. Cazorla in 1231, Úbeda in 1233, Córdoba in 1236, Jaén in 1246, and finally Seville, the largest of the Andalusian cities, in December 1248. In little more than 20 years, the map of the Iberian Peninsula had been dramatically redrawn, but amid this avalanche of conquests, there was one exception, one city that resisted, a city that the Christian armies could not take, and its name was Granada. Situated at the southern tip of the peninsula, protected by mountains and a topography that made any military siege extraordinarily difficult, Granada not only survived the Christian advance, but flourished. The survival of Granada was the result of a combination of diplomatic cunning, the payment of tributes, and remarkable political skill on the part of its rulers, the Nasrids. The history of this dynasty begins with Muhammad ibn Yusuf ibn Nasr, better known as Ibn al-Ahmar. His origins were likely modest, linked to the city of Arjona, but his reputation as a military leader grew rapidly in the turbulent years following the collapse of Almohad power in the Iberian Peninsula. In July 1232, the inhabitants of the Arjona region proclaimed Ibn al-Ahmar as their emir. In the following years, through consensus more than conquest, cities such as Jaén, Guadix, Almería, and Malaga accepted his authority. In 1237, he entered Granada and made it his capital. Ibn al-Ahmar was a pragmatist. In 1246, he ceded Jaén to Ferdinand III and agreed to become a vassal of Castile, committing to pay substantial annual tributes. In exchange, he obtained a 21-year truce that allowed him to consolidate his power and lay the foundations of the Nasrid dynasty. It is said that upon surrendering Jaén, he uttered the words that would become his family's motto, "Wala ghaliba illa Allah." There is no victor but God. This phrase would echo through the centuries, inscribed countless times on the walls and arches of what would become the ultimate symbol of Nasrid civilization. Because it was under this dynasty that one of the most extraordinary architectural achievements in human history was born: the Alhambra Palace. The name Alhambra comes from the Arabic Alcala Alhamra, which means the Red Fortress, a reference to the reddish color of the outer clay walls surrounding the complex, tinted by the iron present in the hill's soil. The hill on which the Alhambra stood, called Sabika, had housed fortifications since at least the 9th century, when only a rudimentary alcazaba existed there, built upon Roman ruins. But it was Muhammad I, the founder of the Nasrid dynasty, who transformed that high point into something much more ambitious. He did not want just a fortress. He wanted a palatine city, a center of power that was simultaneously impenetrable and dazzling, a demonstration of what Islamic civilization was capable of, creating even in its moments of greatest adversity. To achieve this, Muhammad I knew he needed to solve a fundamental problem. The Sabika Hill rose about 200 meters above the Darro River, the region's main watercourse. The Alhambra, atop its plateau, was naturally dry. Without water, there would be no palaces, no gardens, no life. Everything Muhammad I imagined for his capital depended on one single thing: finding a way to make the water go up the hill. And this is where the true story we want to tell begins. Before Muhammad then, water on the Sabika Hill was obtained through precarious means. There were cisterns that collected rainwater, and a karacha, an extension of the wall that descended to the Darro River, allowing direct access to water during times of siege. But this was insufficient for the new sultan's plans. He did not just want water for drinking and cooking. He wanted fountains, gardens, baths, decorative canals, everything that Islamic tradition associated with earthly paradise. To realize this vision, Muhammad I summoned his engineers and ordered the construction of something that would change the landscape of that hill forever. They called it the Acequia del Sultan, the Sultan's Canal, which would become better known as the Acequia Real, the Royal Canal. The idea was both simple and audacious. The engineers followed the course of the Darro River about 6 kilometers upstream until they found a point where the river's altitude was similar to or slightly higher than that of the Sabika Hill. There they built an azud, a small stone dam, which raised the water level by a few meters and diverted it into a new canal. This canal, the Royal Canal, would then run the 6 kilometers back to the Alhambra, following the right bank of the river, maintaining a meticulously calculated slope throughout the entire journey. Ancient irrigation specialists had a saying, "Water must walk, not run." The ideal slope, between 2 and 3 millimeters per meter, needed to be maintained with absolute precision along the entire route. If it were too steep, the water would run too fast, eroding the canal and carrying sediment. If it were too gentle, the water would stagnate. The Nasrid engineers understood this balance with a mastery that impresses even modern hydrologists. The terrain, however, was not cooperative. The Royal Canal had to bypass the Cerro del Sol, the Hill of the Sun, a rocky formation with steep slopes and deep ravines. For more than half of the journey, workers had to excavate tunnels directly into the mountain's conglomerate rock, creating underground galleries through which the water passed unseen, protected from the sun and evaporation. In the deepest ravines, they built small aqueducts. At every point, precision was fundamental. A calculation error of a few centimeters could compromise the entire system. The result was an engineering work that, in its essence, relied solely on gravity. Without pumps, without motors, without any artificial propulsion mechanism, the water traveled 6 kilometers of rugged terrain and arrived at the Alhambra with a constant and controlled flow. It was the triumph of observation, calculation, and the knowledge accumulated by generations of Islamic engineers, heirs to traditions dating back to the Qanat systems of ancient Persia and the irrigation techniques developed in Mesopotamia and North Africa. When the water finally reached the Alhambra, it entered through the eastern side of the complex via an aqueduct that crossed a ravine next to the Torre del Agua, the water tower. From that point, it was distributed through an increasingly complex network of canals, tanks, and conduits that took the water to every corner of the citadel. The Royal Canal was not just an irrigation ditch, it was the vital artery of an entire city. The water it brought supplied a population estimated at around 2,000 people. It served for drinking, cooking, and bathing. It irrigated the agricultural terraces of the Generalife, the country estate adjacent to the Alhambra, where fruits, vegetables, and grains were grown to feed the court and its servants. It fed the hammams, the public baths that were an essential part of social and religious life in Islamic culture. And perhaps most remarkably, it gave life to the fountains, reflecting pools and gardens that transformed the Alhambra into what it would become, a reflection of paradise on earth. In Islamic tradition, water carries deep symbolism. It represents purity, life, and renewal. The Quran describes paradise as a garden crossed by rivers, and this image profoundly influenced Islamic architecture over the centuries. In the case of the Alhambra, water was not just functional, it was part of the palace's very aesthetic language. Nasrid architects used it as a design element, the sound of murmuring. Flowing water created an atmosphere of tranquility. The reflecting pools in the courtyards mirrored the arcades and the skies, doubling the beauty of the architecture. The narrow channels crossing the marble floors evoked the four rivers of the Quranic paradise. The Court of the Myrtles, with its large rectangular pool flanked by myrtle hedges, is perhaps the most perfect example of this fusion between water and architecture. The perfectly calm surface of the pool becomes a mirror that reflects the facade of the Kamari's palace with almost surreal clarity. It is impossible to know where the building ends and the reflection begins. This effect was not accidental. Engineers calculated the depth and positioning of the pool with a precision that ensured the water's maximum reflective capacity. But the Royal Canal, as impressive as it was, had a fundamental limitation. The water it brought reached the Alhambra by gravity, flowing in an open channel with a gentle slope. This meant it arrived with very little pressure. It was enough to supply tanks and shallow channels, but not to power fountains with high jets, baths with hot water showers, or complex hydraulic mechanisms. And the designers of the Alhambra had plans much more ambitious than simple irrigation canals. They wanted elegant fountains that launched jets of water into the sky. They wanted bathhouses with showers and underfloor heating. And, as we will see later, they wanted something even more extraordinary, a clock powered by water. To achieve all this, the engineers needed to find a way to increase the water pressure, and the solution they found was ingeniously simple. Raise the water to a point much higher than the palace and let gravity do the rest. In an area above the Alhambra, engineers excavated a large storage reservoir known as an albercon. Water from the Royal Canal was diverted into an underground conduit that took it to a deep well located about 60 meters below the level of the reservoir. It was a considerable drop, and the water accumulated there waiting to be raised. At the top of the well, the engineers installed a water wheel, or noria, equipped with buckets attached to a chain or rope. This wheel was powered by an animal, usually a donkey or a mule, which walked in circles, moving the mechanism. As the wheel turned, the buckets descended empty to the bottom of the well and rose full of water, dumping their contents into the reservoir above. It was slow and steady work, but extremely effective. The reservoir could store about 400 cubic meters of water, the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of liters. It was an enormous amount for a medieval system, and it fulfilled two vital functions. First, by keeping all this water stored at a high point above the palace, a natural hydrostatic pressure was created. Gravity pushed the water down the hill through closed pipes, and the greater the difference in altitude between the reservoir and the exit point, the greater the pressure. This allowed the water to exit with enough force to power fountains with vertical jets, showers in the baths, and all kinds of hydraulic mechanisms. Second, the reservoir functioned as a strategic reserve. In times of drought, when the flow of the Darro River decreased and the Royal Canal brought less water, the reservoir ensured that the palace remained supplied for days or even weeks. In a region where summers are long and hot and water scarcity was a constant threat, this reserve was essential for the security and independence of the Alhambra. From the reservoir, the water crossed an aqueduct and entered the palace complex. And it is from here that things become truly fascinating. Once inside the Alhambra, the water split into an intricate network of carefully designed channels. Each branch carried exactly the amount of water needed to feed a specific fountain, a pool, a garden, or a bathhouse. The diameters of the pipes, the heights of the orifices, and the angles of inclination were calculated with a precision that allowed the system to function almost autonomously, without the need for constant human intervention. The water flowed where it was supposed to flow, in the right amount and with the right pressure, as if the palace itself breathed through its veins of water. And at the heart of this system, at the intersection of the main axes of the palace complex, was the most spectacular work of all, the Court of the Lions. Built by order of Sultan Muhammad V during the second period of his reign, between 1362 and 1391, the Court of the Lions represented the pinnacle of Nasrid architecture. It was a rectangular space surrounded by 124 white marble columns, so slender they seemed to defy the very idea of support, creating a forest of stone that filtered the light and produced constantly moving shadows. The walls were covered in stucco carved in dizzyingly complex geometric and vegetal patterns, with Arabic inscriptions that included verses from the Quran and poems by Ibn Zamrak, the great poet of the Nasrid court. The ceilings featured muqarnas vaults, those decorative structures made of thousands of tiny honeycomb-shaped cells that created an impression of infinity, as if the ceiling were dissolving into plaster stalactites suspended in the air. But the true protagonist of the courtyard was the fountain that occupied its center. Known as the Fuente de los Leones, the Fountain of the Lions, it consisted of a large white marble basin supported by 12 lion sculptures, also in marble, arranged in a circle and facing outward. From the mouth of each lion, water gushed, feeding 4 shallow channels that extended toward the 4 cardinal points of the courtyard, evoking the 4 rivers of Islamic paradise. The basin, carved from a single block of Mikael marble from the province of Almeria, weighed more than 3 tons. Around its rim, a poem by Ibn Zamrak was engraved, celebrating the beauty of the water and the ingenuity of the fountain. Each lion was unique, with subtle differences in the mane, ears, tail, and facial expression, as if each possessed its own personality. But the Fountain of the Lions was much more than a work of art. There is a serious hypothesis, supported by archaeological evidence and hydraulic studies, that it functioned as a water clock. The idea is fascinating and deserves to be explained carefully. In the center of the fountain, there was an internal mechanism connected to the main basin. Water entered the basin through a central pipe at a slow and constant flow, carefully regulated. As the water level rose inside the basin, it reached holes positioned at very specific heights along the inner wall of the basin. Each hole was connected, via internal piping, to one of the 12 lions. The arrangement of the holes followed an ascending spiral pattern. The first hole was positioned at the lowest part and the 12th at the highest part. As the water rose slowly, it reached the first hole after exactly 1 hour, and water began to flow from the mouth of the first lion. An hour later, the level rose enough to reach the second hole, and a second lion began to spout water, and so on, hour after hour. At noon, 12 hours after the start of the cycle, all 12 lions would be spouting water simultaneously, and the basin would be completely full. And then something remarkable happened. Inside the basin, there was a mechanism called a siphon, based on the same principle known since antiquity as the Pythagorean cup or greedy cup. When the water reached the highest point inside the siphon, it began to overflow on the opposite side and descend through a drainage pipe. At that moment, a seal was created. Air could not enter to replace the falling water. The surface tension of i.e. The falling water pulled the rest of the water in the basin with it, creating a suction effect that emptied the entire basin in a matter of seconds. It was an automatic reset, completely natural, without any mechanical or human intervention. Once empty, the basin began to be filled again by the central pipe, and the entire 12-hour cycle started over. For this mechanism to work with the precision of a clock, two conditions were absolutely essential. First, the inflow of water had to be strictly constant. Any variation in the flow would change the time it took for the water to reach each hole, destroying the system's accuracy. Nasrid engineers achieved this through flow regulators in the piping system feeding the fountain, possibly using the principle of communicating vessels and intermediate chambers that dampened pressure fluctuations. Second, the positioning of the holes had to be calculated with extraordinary precision, taking into account not only the height, but also the rate of water exit at each point, which increased as more holes were activated. The mathematics behind these calculations was complex, but the engineers of the time mastered these principles. Islamic civilization had produced some of the greatest hydraulic engineers in history, such as Al-Jazari, who in the 12th century documented dozens of water-powered mechanical devices, including clocks, automata, and ornamental fountains. The Banu Musa, three brothers who lived in Baghdad in the 9th century, had written detailed treatises on ingenious devices using siphons, valves, and flow control mechanisms. The engineers of the Alhambra were direct heirs to this intellectual tradition. It is important to note that the hypothesis of the water clock in the Fountain of the Lions remains debated among historians. The fountain was modified countless times over the centuries, and after the Christian conquest of Granada in 1492, there are reports that the new occupants dismantled the mechanism to try to understand how it worked, but were unable to reassemble it. During a restoration in the 19th century, a marble cylinder perforated with holes at different heights was found, connected to internal pipes, which seems to corroborate the clock theory. A more recent restoration, started in 2002 and completed in 2011, brought new information about the fountain's hydraulic system but did not restore the clock function. Still, whether or not the clock hypothesis is true, what is indisputable is that the Fountain of the Lions represented an extraordinary feat of hydraulic engineering, a fusion of art and science that had no parallel anywhere in medieval Europe. From the Fountain of the Lions, the water was not lost. It continued its journey through the palace via the 4 shallow channels that extended from the base of the fountain, crossing the courtyard toward other spaces in the complex. These channels, embedded in the marble floor, were not just functional. They were part of the architectural design, water lines that organized the space and guided the visitor's eye, connecting different environments like arteries connecting the organs of a living body. And one of the most important destinations for this water was a space that combined engineering, luxury, and diplomacy in a way that few other places in the medieval world managed: the royal baths. The baths of the Alhambra, known as the Baño de Mi, Comares baths, are considered the best preserved example of a medieval Islamic hammam in the entire Western world. Their importance went far beyond hygiene. In Islamic culture, bathing was a ritual of physical and spiritual purification, a social practice where business was conducted, alliances were forged, and political decisions were made. The sultans of Granada received ambassadors and diplomats in the baths, where the intimacy of the environment, devoid of court formalities, favored frank conversations and delicate agreements. The structure of the baths followed a model inspired by ancient Roman baths, adapted by Islamic tradition. There were 3 main environments: a cold room, a warm room, and a hot room, each with a specific function in the bathing ritual. The water arriving from the palace channels entered an underground control room, where it passed through a copper cauldron heated by burning wood. From there, the hot water was distributed via pipes to the various fountains and showers in the baths. The heating system was particularly ingenious. To create the heated floor in the hot room, the steam generated by the cauldron was directed through channels excavated under the marble pavement. The heat from the steam warmed the floor from below, creating a warm surface that radiated heat throughout the environment. It was a system similar to the Roman hypocaust, adapted and refined by Islamic engineers. But the ingenuity did not stop at the floor. The steam continued its vertical journey, rising through hollow pillars to the steam room, where it exited through small openings in the walls, filling the room with a hot, humid mist. The ceiling of the steam room was adorned with star-shaped windows, openings that could be opened or closed manually. When open, they allowed excess steam to escape, reducing the temperature and humidity. When closed, they retained the steam, intensifying the heat. This simple ventilation mechanism gave bath operators remarkable control over environmental conditions, allowing them to adjust the bathing experience to each visitor's preferences. The light entering through the star-shaped openings created geometric patterns in the steam, projecting ephemeral constellations on the stucco walls. It was a complete sensory experience. The enveloping heat of the steam, the aroma of burning wood, the sound of water falling into the fountains, and that filtered light that seemed to come from another world. While the water traveled through the palace, feeding fountains, baths, and gardens, it performed yet another crucial function, one that might go unnoticed by visitors, but was essential for making the Alhambra habitable during the long, scorching Andalusian summers: cooling. Granada is situated in one of the hottest regions of Spain. In the summer, temperatures can easily exceed 40 degrees Celsius, 104 degrees. But inside the high Alhambra, the climate was surprisingly mild. The reason was the water. When hot air passed over the surfaces of the tanks, channels, and fountains scattered throughout the complex, some of that water evaporated. Evaporation is a process that absorbs heat from the surrounding environment. The result was that the air circulating through the courtyards and corridors of the Alhambra was naturally cooled, creating a kind of natural air conditioning. Nasrid architects exploited this phenomenon deliberately. The distribution of tanks and fountains was strategically planned to maximize the evaporative cooling effect. Courtyards with central fountains functioned as chambers of fresh air, and the breeze crossing the corridors carried refreshing humidity with it. The vegetation surrounding the palace was also part of this system. The Generalife gardens, irrigated by the Royal Canal, were filled with orange trees, cypresses, myrtles, and rose bushes that provided shade and contributed to temperature regulation. The result was an artificial microclimate, a bubble of coolness amidst the Andalusian heat, created entirely by natural means. In an era when most European castles and palaces were suffocating structures in the summer, the Alhambra offered a thermal comfort that would only be matched with the advent of mechanical climate control in the 20th century. The water continued its journey through the complex, always flowing from east to west, following the natural topography of the hill. And when it reached the western portion of the Alhambra, it encountered its last great challenge. At the western end of the complex sat the Alcazaba, the military fortress itself, the original defensive core of the Alhambra. This was where the soldiers lived and stood guard, protecting the palaces and their inhabitants. And the Alcazaba was built on a point slightly higher than the rest of the palace, about 6 meters above the level where the water arrived. 6 meters may seem like little, but for a hydraulic system that relied exclusively on gravity, it was a significant obstacle. Water by its nature flows down, not up, and the engineers had already used water wheels with buckets to raise water to the main reservoir. But for this last stretch, they devised something different, something that required no wheels, no animals, and no external power source. The device they created was a remarkable example of engineering. Based on the principles of fluid physics, the water from the system was directed into a container with a hole at the bottom connected to another container below. As the water descended through the hole, it created a vortex, a whirlpool in the upper container. In the center of this whirlpool, a low-pressure zone formed that sucked air into the water flow. The resulting mixture of air and water was then forced into a narrow tube. The principle behind this was ingenious. Under normal, Conditions: the potential energy on both sides of a system of communicating vessels is equal, meaning water pushed down one tube would push water up the opposite tube to the same height, but aerated water, full of microscopic air bubbles, was lighter than pure water. This meant that to balance the same potential energy, the column of aerated water needed to be taller than the column of pure water. The practical result was that the water rose in the narrow tube to a height higher than where it had started, overcoming the 6-meter elevation difference without any mechanical power source. It was the water itself, combined with air, that performed the work of lifting. It is important to recognize that this specific aspect of the Alhambra's hydraulic system is the least documented and most debated among specialists. Some sources suggest that the pressure accumulated in the system, coming from the elevated reservoir, might have been enough to overcome the 6-meter difference without the need for an aerating device. Others argue that a mechanism similar to the one described, based on air injection into the water, was indeed used. Regardless of the exact mechanism, the fact is that the water reached the Alcazaba. The soldiers guarding the Alhambra had access to running water, fountains, and all the infrastructure the system provided. It was a feat that impressed friends and enemies alike. Visitors and diplomats who arrived at the Alhambra reported with astonishment that the Emir of Granada seemed to have found a way to make water flow uphill, defying the laws of nature. It was clear this was not magic, but knowledge, a deep and sophisticated knowledge accumulated over centuries of experimentation and study. The engineers of the Alhambra were heirs to a long line of innovators. Persian Qanat systems were adapted and refined in the Iberian Peninsula. Roman techniques for aqueducts and hypocausts were incorporated and improved. And Islamic tradition added its own innovations, such as the extensive use of siphons, flow control valves, and automated mechanical devices. Al-Jazari, the great Kurdish engineer of the 12th century, had documented dozens of water-powered devices. The Banu Musa, in the 9th century, had described similar systems in Baghdad. This rich tradition was the heritage upon which the builders of the Alhambra relied. And for over 2 centuries, while the Nasrid sultans ruled Granada, this heritage was constantly expanded and refined. The Alhambra was not built all at once. It grew organically, palace by palace, garden by garden, with each sultan adding his own contribution. Muhammad III laid the foundations with the Royal Canal and the Alcazaba. Muhammad II strengthened the walls and expanded the supply system. Muhammad III built the Partal Palace, the oldest of the remaining palaces, whose arcades are reflected in a rectangular pool that has remained virtually unchanged since the early 14th century. Ismail I and his son Yusuf built the Comares Palace with its imposing Comares Tower and its splendid Hall of the Ambassadors, where the carved wooden ceiling represents the 7 heavens of Islamic cosmology. And Muhammad V, during his second reign, built the Court of the Lions, the crown of the Alhambra, the space where art, engineering, and spirituality merged into a harmony that still leaves visitors breathless today. Each of these additions involved expansions and adaptations of the hydraulic system. New canals were excavated, new flow regulators were installed, new distribution points were created. The system grew in complexity but maintained its coherence. It was like a symphony where new instruments were added over the centuries, but the fundamental melody, the flow of water from the Darro River to the last corner of the palace, remained the same. The Alhambra was not just a palace, it was a complete city. Within its walls were mosques, public hammams, artisan workshops, residences, and all the apparatus necessary for urban life. There were at least 6 major palaces, most situated along the northern edge of the complex, offering a stunning view over the Albayacin neighborhood, separated from the Alhambra by the valley of the Darro River. Water was the common thread that united all these spaces, connecting the sacred to the secular, the functional to the aesthetic. Without it, the Alhambra would have been just another fortress on a dry hill. With it, it became an inhabited garden, a fortress that flourished, a palace that murmured, but nothing lasts forever. Throughout the 15th century, as the Alhambra reached its architectural zenith, the Emirate of Granada faced increasing pressures. Internal struggles for the Nasrid throne weakened the state's cohesion. Rival factions vied for power in a series of coups and counter-coups that undermined the government's capacity. And at the same time, the external landscape was changing decisively. In 1469, the marriage of Ferdinand II of Aragon to Isabella of Castile unified the two largest Christian kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula under common leadership. The Catholic monarchs, as they became known, had a declared mission to complete the Reconquista and expel the last Muslims from Iberia. The Granada War began in 1482 and lasted a decade. City by city, castle by castle, Christian forces surrounded the emirate. Malaga fell in 1487, Baza and Almeria fell in 1489. Granada became isolated, without allies and without supply routes. By 1491, the city of Granada itself was under siege. Muhammad Thutus, known to the Spanish as Boabdil, the last Nasrid Sultan, negotiated the terms of surrender. On November 25, 1491, the Treaty of Granada was signed, establishing the conditions of capitulation. And on January 2, 1492, Boabdil handed over the keys of Granada to Ferdinand and Isabella. According to tradition, when Boabdil looked back from a mountain pass and saw the Alhambra and the city his family had ruled for 260 years for the last time, he wept. His mother, Aixa, is said to have told him, "Weep like a woman for what you could not defend as a man." The spot became known as El Último Suspiro del Moro, the Moor's last sigh. It is perhaps an apocryphal story, but it captures the magnitude of that moment. With the fall of Granada, nearly 8 centuries of Islamic presence in the Iberian Peninsula came to an end. But the Alhambra did not fall. The Christian conquerors, unlike what they did in many other cities, did not destroy the palace. They were dazzled by its beauty and decided to inhabit it. Ferdinand and Isabella established their temporary residence there. Later, Emperor Charles V ordered the construction of a Renaissance palace within the complex, a Florentine-style structure that contrasts with the delicacy of Nasrid architecture. But even Charles V did not destroy the old palaces. The Alhambra remained standing, and the water continued to flow. Over the following centuries, the Alhambra went through periods of neglect and deterioration. There were fires, earthquakes, and the erosion of time. In the Napoleonic era, French troops caused significant damage, but even so, the fundamental structure survived, and the hydraulic system kept working. In the 19th century, the American writer Washington Irving lived temporarily in the Alhambra and wrote Tales of the Alhambra, a work that helped awaken international interest in the palace. Irving described the fountains still active, the canals still murmuring, the water still traveling the same paths that Muhammad Afun's engineers had mapped out 600 years earlier. In the 20th century, systematic restoration efforts began. The Fountain of the Lions was restored several times, with a major intervention between 2002 and 2011 that allowed for a detailed study of the internal hydraulic system. The Royal Canal was partially recovered by the Council of the Alhambra and Generalife, and today, visitors from all over the world can walk through the same corridors where sultans and diplomats once walked, hear the sound of water running through marble channels, and feel the coolness that evaporation provided to the palace inhabitants 7 centuries ago. The Alhambra receives more than 2 million visitors a year and is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Alhambra is not its visual beauty, as stunning as it may be. Perhaps it is not the carved stucco, nor the muqarnas vaults, nor the geometric tiles that seem to stretch to infinity. Perhaps the most remarkable thing is what is not immediately seen: the water. The invisible network of canals and pipes running under the floors, inside the walls, behind the fountains. The system that, for nearly 800 years, brought life to a dry hill and transformed it into a paradise. The engineers who designed this system did not leave their names for posterity. We only know they mastered their craft with a skill that still surprises us. They understood fluid physics before the discipline even had that name. They calculated pressures, flows, and volumes with tools we would consider primitive, yet they produced results that rival those of any modern engineer. And they created something that transcended its time, a system so well designed that it still works, still carries water to the same gardens, still feeds the same fountains, still cools the same courtyards after almost 8 centuries. In an age where we build to last decades, the Alhambra reminds us that it is possible to build to last millennia. The wisdom of the ancients, when applied with ingenuity and respect for nature, produces results that no technology can surpass: durability, beauty, and harmony with the surrounding world. Water still flows through the Alhambra, and as long as it flows, the memory of those anonymous engineers will remain alive, whispered by the sound of water in every fountain, in every canal, in every reflection that doubles the beauty of that palace that refused to die. The Alhambra is proof that engineering, when elevated to the level of art, transcends time. If this story about the extraordinary engineering of the Alhambra sparked your curiosity, imagine how many other wonders like this are still waiting to be discovered and told. Subscribe to the channel to follow more documentary narratives that reveal the secrets behind humanity's greatest works. Leave a like so more people can learn stories like this, and tell us in the comments which part of the Alhambra's hydraulic system impressed you the most. Was it the Royal Canal, traveling 6 kilometers of mountain, the Fountain of the Lions, which possibly functioned as a water clock, the Royal Baths with their heated floors and star windows, or the ingenious device that made water rise without any external force? Your participation helps us bring more stories like this. See you in the next documentary.